پنل اول ما پنل نگاه تطبیقی هستش به مجازات اعدام در ایران و در امریکا. من به انگلیسی صحبت میکنم از این به بعد به دلیل اینکه پنلمون به انگلیسی هستش و اگر که نیاز هست میتونم به فارسی برگردونم، ولی اگر در سالن مشکلی نیست به انگلیسی ادامه میدیم. سخنران اولمون خانم زامورا هستش که اینجا هستش. Anna, would you mind joining me on the panel? Dr. Erik Burunson was going to join us also from Texas. Unfortunately, due to a family emergency that happened for him yesterday, he can't join us in person, but if we can technologically make it happen, he's the other side of Skype and he will give us his Skype presentation, and then he'll be here with us in the question and answers. Also, we have a speaker who is in the West Bank of Palestine in Gaza, and she is also going to join us via Skype. But we've taped her presentation just in case there are problems with internet between us and Palestine. But we're here with Anna first, so I will say a few words to introduce Anna. Anna works for ACLU, which is the American Civil Liberties Union for North California. She's a death penalty policy director. She will tell us a little bit more about herself when you start, but I'll tell you a little about ACLU. On their website, they say that ACLU is an enduring guardian of justice, fairness, equality, and freedom, working to protect and advance civil liberties for all Californians. The ACLU of Northern California defends and advances civil liberties and rights. They work to make constitutional rights a reality for everyone. Their legal and legislative advocacy fights for freedom, fairness, and justice and equality. And by organizing and public education, they hope to empower communities and help people stand up for their rights. This is because they're a civil liberties union, but Anna is the head of the policy for death penalty. So we're going to hear more about how she plans and campaigns, and if we have questions about what happens here in California, we can ask her, because for me, it was a question when I was looking at some facts and statistics of death penalty here in the United States. I was amazed to hear that 741 people are on death row here in California, but because they're not being executed, not that we want them to be executed, but because they're not being executed, they are in this indeterminate position in limbo, and that's a lot of people to be in that position. So we have 10 minutes for you to speak, and then we hope to be able to, if we can technologically, have a dialogue with Erik and with Soraya in the West Bank. If not, then I'm sure there'll be a lot of questions and we can get together. So please, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Roya, and thank you so much for having me here today. It's quite an honor to be speaking with you all, and it's exciting for me. I live and breathe, this is going to sound bizarre, but I literally do live and breathe the death penalty every day of my life, but it's right here in California, and it's exciting and fascinating to me to go beyond the borders of California, beyond the borders of the United States, and look at a country like Iran that has a very different experience with the death penalty than we do here in California. So this has been very exciting and fascinating for me. And I also just want to say, usually when I speak to a group, I try to tailor what I say to what has been said before me, but I have no idea what was said before me. So if I say anything that's totally out of context, I apologize in advance. I speak English and Spanish, and that's it. And is there somebody interpreting?
No, but I will give a brief translation of what you've said afterwards.
Okay, so do you want me to...
And when you give us your paper, then we'll translate it and put it on the website.
Do you want...
No, you go ahead,
okay.
And I'll just summarize it in the end.
Oh, okay, sounds good. So yes, it's hard to know where to begin, but I think I just wanted to begin with a second about me and how I came to this position. So after I graduated from college with my undergraduate degree, my bachelor's degree, I found a job like any college kid needed to do after he or she graduates. And I found myself working as an administrative assistant at one of are defense agencies here in California called the California Appellate Project. And that organization defends people on death row in California in their appeals process. And I was just, I was an administrative assistant. I was, doing administrative tasks. But in that job, I started to learn about the death penalty. It was not part of my reality. It was not part of my life prior to this job. I learned about the death penalty, and I started to develop this sense of injustice. And it kind of stuck with me, and it made me sick to my stomach, quite frankly. I learned that the death penalty is full of misinformation, and most people, A, they don't think about it, and B, they don't know the reality of the system. One of the things that struck me the most about the death penalty in the United States is that we're taught to believe that the death penalty is reserved for the worst of the worst, the most heinous murderers. But the reality is not that. The reality is the death penalty in the United States is reserved for the most damaged, broken people. It's reserved for people that are mentally retarded, who have a low IQ. Not mentally retarded, but don't have a low IQ. It's reserved for people that are mentally ill. It's reserved for people that are addicted to drugs and alcohol. It's reserved for people who were severely traumatized as children. It really is, the people that are living on death rows in the United States are the most damaged, sad people. They're people that could not convince 12 of their peers to spare their life. I assure you, anybody in this room, no matter what crime we committed, we could convince 12 people in the United States to spare our life. But the people on death row in this country couldn't do that. So I was struck with this, like I said, this severe injustice, and I decided that I needed to spend the rest of my life fighting it. And I wanted to see the day when the death penalty was no longer part of American jurisprudence. So fast forward 10 years, and I'm still fighting for that. So my job at the ACLU as death penalty policy director is to end the death penalty in California, excuse me. My job is not to, change people's minds. My job is not to reduce death sentences. My job is not to stop executions. That's all part of my job. But my job, I have one goal. It is to end the death penalty in California. The problem with that, it's not very easy. And in California, the only way we end the death penalty is by getting 50 plus 1 voters to vote to get rid of it. And California is the most populated state in the entire country. We have a lot of people here, and it's a huge, huge task to get 50.1% of voters to agree to give up the death penalty. Myself and the people that came before me in this fight have been working for over 30 years to study this issue and to study how people feel about it, and more importantly, what moves people to agree to get rid of the death penalty. And in 2012, just 2 years ago, we came to the realization that we were ready, that the voters of California were ready to get rid of the death penalty. And so we filed a ballot initiative, that's what we have here, and it was on the November 2012 ballot. So the other things that were on that ballot was to re-elect President Obama, for instance. So it was a big election year. We launched a big campaign. Our messages were perfect. Every word our campaign used was tested, proven to change people's minds. And at the end of the day, we came so close. 12 million votes were cast in that election. 12 million people in this state voted on Proposition 34, which was our initiative. And at the end of the day, 48% voted yes to get rid of the death penalty, and 52 said they wanted it to stay. That means that we had a margin of 500,000 votes, which means if we could have successfully changed the minds of just 250,000 more voters, we would have won. And today, California would not have the death penalty. 250,000 people out of 12 million. You can imagine we were shocked and very sad. But what it did do is it proved that now California is nearly, almost divided, evenly divided on how we feel about the death penalty. It's no longer a vast majority of people in California want executions. No, that's not true anymore, actually. We're evenly divided, and we know that next time we go forward with an initiative in California, we will win, absolutely. There's no question about it. So even though we lost in November 2012, it was the motivation that we all needed, that this movement needed here in California and nationally, to prove that we're in the what is it, the what's that quote, the arc of justice, right? That we are in an arc of justice, and we are moving away from executions and from these harsh punishments that don't help us at all. And California is on that arc, and we will soon be a death penalty-free state, if I have anything to do with it. Anyway, so thank you.
Thank you. I'd love to hear more about your campaigning and these very carefully chosen words that you have, because we hope to learn from each other. That's one of the aims of this panel and also this conference, that if we can learn from each other, it will be a huge step for us. We are at the beginning. Yes. Of the ladder, and you're almost there, which is wonderful. I don't know, can you show us a video, or you can? Okay, so I'm now going to introduce Soraya Bonus. She's the Middle East and North Africa Fellow and a member of the death penalty team of the European Commission Project for Reprieve. If I tell you a little about Reprieve, Reprieve is a non-governmental organization, non-profit action NGO that uses the law to enforce the human rights of prisoners from death row to the war on terror. They're based in London. They have fellows working on the ground. Their goal is to provide free legal assistance to persons facing the death penalty. And their motto is, we investigate, we litigate, and we educate. And Reprieve has over 10 years of experience of assisting British and European nationals sentenced to death in the US and around the world, including Indonesia, Pakistan, the Middle East, and North Africa. And most recently, in the last few weeks, they've taken up a case in Iran. So it's the first time that Reprieve's managed to actually approach something in Iran. I had a very interesting chat with Soraya before we were filming about how you can actually go to a country that can actually create problems for the people who are working with you. You could actually endanger lives. And she was saying that there are so many different ways that you can collaborate with the international community, and you can work in together, but not necessarily openly, and they support the lawyers. It's not their only experience in working in countries that don't recognize organizations like Reprieve. So she's not allowed to discuss the case in Iran. She will give us an example of a case that she worked on. Hopefully when they're a little more advanced about their case in Iran, we get to hear more about how Reprieve works on it. Reprieve has also defended people in Guantanamo Bay, so when we talk about war on terror, so that they're not just looking at people here, Europeans or Americans out there, but they're also looking at them over here on death row. So if we can watch a little of what Soraya can say, and hopefully we can then have her on Skype. I know she's sitting there with her cup of coffee. It's 12 midnight where she is, and she's hoping to join us in Skype, with Skype, if we can manage to get connected. But if we watch her presentation first, please. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Soraya, and I am Reprieve's Middle East and North Africa coordinator. And today I'd like to talk to you a bit about the strategies Reprieve uses to assist European nationals facing the death penalty around the world. I'm really sorry I couldn't be there today, but I hope to hear from you about how Reprieve can potentially help you and how you might also be able to help us. Our motto is we investigate, we litigate, and we educate. And I hope that through the strategies I discussed, you can get a sense of how our motto really does come into play. Once we have identified a case, we work closely with the relevant governments, with the prisoner's local lawyers and NGOs in order to ensure that the prisoner has as much support as possible. And this can have important ramifications for assisting and upholding the defendant's right to a fair trial and generally upholding the rights of the accused. The ultimate goal of our work is to ensure that the fields of the death penalty are narrowed. We also aim to work with the EU in terms of identifying cases where EU minimum standards on the death penalty have been violated. So we are particularly interested in cases where juveniles and mentally ill or those with intellectual disabilities have been sentenced to death. So the first strategy that we employ is investigation work. Mitigation investigation is quite an important part of this. So what we can do is facilitate medical experts or forensic experts to review evidence or submit evidence. Another way that we can support mitigating evidence submissions is by reviewing medical records or school records that might indicate mental illness or intellectual disability, which will then help in litigation. In some cases, we do victim outreach, where in cases of murder in particular, the victim's forgiveness will be essential in ensuring that the defendant does not receive the death sentence. And finally, if there are foreign ties, we can establish those through family history research and then ensure that the nationality is recognised by the European government, which will in turn often assist in filing submissions to the court on behalf of their foreign national. And that leads me on to the legal strategies that we employ. We can advise local lawyers on international law arguments that they can raise at trial. This can include submissions from international bodies and European governments, but we can also file complaints on behalf of people where rights of the accused have been violated by the state. So, for example, in cases where torture has been used to extract a confession, not only can submissions to relevant UN special rapporteurs be submitted, we can also assist local lawyers in getting evidence to support the defence at trial. We also can litigate in Europe because Europe is a good forum to discuss human rights arguments around the death penalty and to get judgments in our favour, which can later be used to apply pressure on governments seeking the death penalty. And this has been particularly effective in the Stop the Lethal Injection project, where we successfully obtained an export ban of execution drugs from the UK to the US. The diplomatic strategies that we use often involve engaging European governments who have nationals facing the death penalty abroad to intervene in these cases because they legitimately can. This can be, for example, in requesting that they provide consular assistance. On a very basic level, a prison visit can do amazing things for the morale of a prisoner, but it can also serve as a venue for the prisoner to raise issues such as violations of due process, torture, denial of legal counsel, and things like that, which can later be used to make representations to the government. Particularly in relation to torture, if a prisoner has raised these allegations, the European government will often support their national through raising these complaints with the local authorities. And if the access has come early enough, they might even be able to make notes in official consular documents, which can then also be obtained and used at trial to support that defence. But diplomatic intervention is very effective only at the beginning. It can be helpful throughout, but we find that it's best from the moment the person is arrested. Now, the issue with this is really in the Middle East and North Africa, and in Iran in particular, the governments do not recognise the person's second nationality. So an issue really does arise with dual nationals. I have to say we're working on this issue and we would love to hear from people who are representing dual nationals and the obstacles they face so that we can try and help you overcome them. Media can sometimes be very helpful in cases. Once we have decided that media can be pursued and should be pursued, the ultimate goal of it is to raise public awareness about the case, particularly in non-lethal offences, and also where there have been gross violations of due process. And this also helps reinforce arguments that can be raised in different avenues. So, for example, if you've gone to the United Nations, this can be a very important press hook. And again, this can imply is going to apply pressure on the government assisting the national facing the death penalty, but in turn apply pressure on the government seeking the death penalty in itself. So I would like to talk to you about one of our cases that we worked on very recently, and that is of Hasnan Ali in the United Arab Emirates. Hasnan is a 32-year-old British national who was badly tortured by police in Dubai when he was arrested in May 2013. In April, he was acquitted of all offences, but he was originally facing a death sentence for drugs charges. We met with Mr. Ali in jail and we gathered information on the torture that he was subjected to, which was very horrific. It included beatings, threats of sexual assault, sleep deprivation, and threats with weapons. At the end of 4 days of torture, he was forced to sign a confession in Arabic, a language that he does not read, write, or understand. Through the gathering of this evidence supporting the claim of torture, we were able to help his legal team raise that defense at trial. We gathered some witness statements from prisoners who saw the extensive injuries on Mr. Ali, and they then testified at trial. We also got an independent medical review of a report conducted by the public prosecution into the lack of injuries actually that were sustained. And this was also very helpful for their lawyers to uphold the defense of torture. At the same time, we worked with the British government to apply pressure on the UAE authorities to comply with international law. So I hope that this case has shown that the investigative work and the litigation work that we do can really have positive effects on cases. But I say that because we know that we were able to intervene immediately. We found out about his arrest quite soon after it happened. So I would say that, these things can really help as soon as you really can intervene in the case. At the beginning, I said that our motto was we investigate, we litigate, and we educate. And what I mean by educate is that we want to learn from each other about the successful tools that everyone uses on the path towards abolition. And we are hoping to learn from everyone, particularly in Iran, about the landscape of the use of death penalty and potentially where we might be able to help you. We have been very successful in representing foreign nationals and European nationals. So I ask, do you know a European national or a foreign national or a dual national facing the death penalty in Iran? Because if you do, we might be able to help. Alternatively, are you representing or do you know someone representing someone sentenced to death for a non-lethal offence who is mentally ill or intellectually disabled? We are always happy to promote best practices and share information. So I hope that you will get in contact with us so that we can help towards a moratorium in Iran and eventually abolition. Thank you.
اینترنت ما وصله یا بعد یا بعد بریک بدیم؟ اینترنت وصله؟ پخش داریم میشیم؟ Okay. I'm sorry that we can't connect with Skype with either Soraya or with Dr. Bronson. I do hope that they're listening to us, and please accept my apologies that we have technological issues here and we can't get connected. I do hope that Dr. Bronson's family emergency is better and he can send us the paper that he was going to talk to us here about, so we can put it on our website. Soraya's full presentation is also going to be on the website. She sent us slides and more information on Reprieve. It's interesting that she was talking about a British national in UAE who was interrogated in Arabic. In Iran, we had recently a young Kurdish woman who was executed, and from prison she was Kurdish, and she wrote that after being severely tortured for many days, she was interrogated in Farsi, a language she didn't understand, and she was forced to sign a confession, again in a language in Farsi because she spoke Kurdish. And so basically she signed her own death sentence by not knowing what it was she was signing. And we were all taking, Shirina Alamhuli is who I'm talking about. And we all took up her case, but unfortunately it took us all by surprise. 5 people were executed, and she was one of those 5 people who were executed together. So that's a stranger in a strange country, but we, in Iran, we have Iranians doing this. What is fascinating for me is the conditions of these 741 prisoners on death row here, and the fact that they're in limbo. how do you go about defending their rights and what happens to them? How are they being kept? What's their status?
So, very good question. It's so complicated, so I will do my best to make it less complicated. So, Roya's right. We have actually almost 750 death row inmates in California. The men are housed in Northern California at San Quentin State Prison, which is one of the oldest, most decrepit prisons in California. And then the women are held down in Southern California, down here, or actually Central California, at the Central Women's Facility. The conditions on death row, it's an interesting thing because California prisons are terribly overcrowded. For those of you who live in California or perhaps even live here in the US, you probably have heard about this because our federal government has told the state of California that our prison conditions are so overcrowded and so deplorable that we're actually being held in federal receivership. In other words, the federal government has taken over the California Department of Corrections. That's how bad it is. So for inmates that are not under sentence of death, the conditions are particularly terrible. Inmates are crammed into bunks, into cell houses, and it's just awful. Medical care is terrible. People die every day, commit suicide. It's terrible mental health problems. However, if you are under sentence of death, you have some perks because you are under sentence of death, because you are considered more dangerous. With a sentence of death, you get a single cell. You are the only person in your cell, which is a coveted thing in California. Because
is that not like solitary confinement?
It's not like solitary confinement, no. Death row is a secluded house, a secluded cell block, excuse me. When you go to yard, when you go out of your cell, you're in your own cell. It's more protected. So we have solitary confinement in California, but it's different. So our solitary confinement is what's called a security housing unit. Those are terrible. That's torture. Although I would argue that a lot of what we do in our prisons is considered torture. But the security housing units, you have no human contact at all. Your cell faces out to a hallway. The lights, the bright lights are on 24/7. And you get no visits, and you get no phone calls. So you are completely isolated 24 hours a day. You don't get to go outside, nothing. But death row inmates, only a very few death row inmates under those conditions, and those are death row inmates that are very, very dangerous. But most death row inmates have single cells, like I said. They have different privileges because they are under sentence of death. And when you're under sentence of death in California, you get more access to attorneys. You get more access to legal proceedings to challenge your conviction. And so they're allowed more room in their cell for stuff, for their boxes of legal documents, for their personal possessions. I can't think of what else, but there's a number of different reasons why death row is a better place to live if you're in California prisons, and it doesn't make any sense. And the biggest reason why is because death row inmates in California are not executed. If you're on death row in California, you are more likely to die of old age than you are of execution.
When was the last execution?
The last execution was in 2006. We have only had 13 executions since 1978, which is considered the modern era of the death penalty in the United States. From 1978 to now, 13 executions, over 85 people have died of old age. And yet we have 750 people on death row, and every single year we send an average of between 25 and 29 new people to death row every year. So our death row keeps on getting bigger and bigger and bigger.
But that's
and nothing
interesting because
happens.
if you're not executing, then why is it people are still getting sentenced to death? If the policy is not to execute, then why issue the sentence?
Well, I think the question is, why do we have a death penalty in California? And the answer, in my opinion, the answer is, there's one answer, and it's politics. The death penalty is incredibly political. There was a time in California history where if you were a politician running for office and you said you were against the death penalty, you have no career as an elected official. So that scared a lot of our elected leaders, and they stayed very far away from the issue, or they said they were adamantly for it. And that has carried over year after year after year. To this day, 2014, we still have Democrats who are running for office, who are liberal Democrats, who still say that they're for the death penalty because they think that if they say otherwise, that they won't get into office. But it's not true anymore. We know this.
I think that's interesting from
Yeah.
what Senator Badinter was also saying, that it takes a little bit of political courage to be able
lot.
to,
I think there's a
to be
question.
able to. So I come back to the panel, to the audience. If you have any questions, I think there was one question about the cost. So please go ahead.
So, very good question, and a very, very important part of the conversation here in California. And in fact, one of the most critical pieces in shifting public opinion here in the United States away from the death penalty is, unfortunately, I guess, the cost. It doesn't make sense to say that the death penalty costs far more than life in prison without the possibility of parole, but that is absolutely the case. In fact, in California, the death penalty costs millions, hundreds of millions of dollars more every year than a sentence of life in prison without parole. And that is for many, many reasons. It starts right at the beginning with the trial. A death penalty trial is longer. It requires more experts. It requires 2 lawyers. It requires mental health mitigation experts. It's extremely expensive. That's just the first part. Then if the trial results in a death sentence, then that person is sent to death row. And as I just explained, someone on death row has a very different arrangement than somebody who's not on death row. And that is a very, very expensive arrangement. Our research shows that somebody on death row, so to live in the general population in California prisons, so that's just a regular non-death sentenced individual, it costs taxpayers in California about $50,000 per inmate per year. That's to house, feed, medical care. If you're on death row, add $90,000 more. So it works out to be about $150,000 per death row inmate per year, which is crazy if you think about how much it is to send a kid to college. It's not that much. So then somebody's living on death row at a very expensive price. Then we have all the appeals, because when you're under sentence of death in the United States, you're treated very, very differently in your appeals process. You essentially have an attorney paid for by the taxpayers for the rest of your life. They can file multiple appeals, multiple challenges. Our appeals go all the way from our state Supreme Court all the way up to the United States Supreme Court, and then back again, and then back again, and then back again, which means that death penalty appeals in California often take an average of 30 years to complete, which is why, again, people on death row are more likely to die of old age than they are of execution. When people learn about the fact that the death penalty costs hundreds of millions of dollars more, and for what, they're very willing to say life in prison without parole should be the maximum punishment in California. But that's just one really important thing, and the other is innocence, which I just wanted to mention. Innocence and the rise of the innocence movement in the last decade in the United States has really helped to shift people's minds about the death penalty. To date, we have identified over 140 people that were sentenced to death in the United States who were innocent, thankfully before they were executed. We also we've realized that we made mistakes, that we've executed innocent people. These stories and these facts really make people think twice about the death penalty. It deeply disturbs people, even people that believe that execution is a moral and just punishment, which many people do. When they hear that the United States makes mistakes, and we've made a lot of them, they think twice about their position. And I just want to put 140 innocent people into context. That's 1 in 10 people who are executed, 1 in 10 people who have been executed in the United States were innocent. So think about it this way. If every time you got on for every 10 times you got on an airplane, the 10th time that airplane crashed and you died, or somebody died, would you ever get on an airplane? I wouldn't. So just to put that into context, it's a very bad statistic for a criminal justice system.
So just to see if we can learn from your experiences of campaigning, you think that identifying cases where people are innocent can affect public opinion?
Absolutely.
And also the cost, of course in Iran we don't have the cost factor because we just execute, we just don't, we never keep people for that length of time, we just execute them on a crane hanging from a thing, so it's never like that. So to campaign is to find innocence and also the cost factor of keeping someone?
Well, that's just here. I mean, I think Iran is very different. But one thing I think that's really important, perhaps in both places, is the voice. I know it's important in Iran. It's the voice of victims. Yes?
I'm sorry that I'm interrupting you. There's one in here in the United States. Innocent man, 20 years and a half in the prison with the DNA negative.
Okay, thank you.
Negative DNA test.
Thank you very much.
Oh, yeah.
Thank you. Are you familiar with this?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's in the United States.
Yeah.
Is this in California?
Yes.
Yeah,
Okay,
yeah,
thank
yeah.
you.
I know of this case.
Yeah.
Yeah, I know of this case.
We'll put the information on our website for you. We'll put it next to Anna's presentation. Are there any questions for Anna? Yes, go ahead.
What is the racial and gender division?
Thank you for bringing that up. So that was something I wanted to talk about because this is race. So the question was, what's the race and gender of death row? And you know, I just want to take a second and put that into context. So the death penalty in the United States is absolutely rooted in our history of slavery. Our death penalty laws yes, they came over from Europe, but they're different, and they are absolutely rooted in this notion during the time of slavery that we needed the threat of execution in order to protect white people from black people. And that was the reality back during slavery. It was to maintain the racial divide, and like I said, to protect white people from black people. That never really changed. It's just it's shifted into today's death penalty laws, and we don't say that we have a death penalty to protect white people from black people anymore. However, the way that the death penalty is applied in this country would suggest otherwise. For instance, the majority of executions in the United States take place in the South, where slavery occurred. If you are a black man, you are 4 times more likely to be sentenced to death for the same crime than somebody who was white who committed that same crime. 4 times more likely. If you're Latino, it's 3 times more likely. That's the race of the defendant. If you look at the race of the victim, white victim, if a black perpetrator murders a white victim, they're more likely to receive a death sentence than if a black perpetrator murders a black victim. So race is very, very much part of our death penalty system. And, you know, going back to the days of slavery where this all started, you know, the reason why they had this threat of execution was, yes, to protect, but it was also to stop any rebellion, right? To dissuade African American slaves from lifting up and using violence or using their voices and rebelling against the laws. It was a means to keep them down, keep them silent for fear of death. And I think that at the end of the day, that's what the death penalty is. It's to keep the people silent and to keep the people from rising up and demanding equality, freedom, justice. So I just wanted to say that because I think it's a really important thing to remember, why countries have the death penalty, why governments use the death penalty. It's not to keep us safe, because we know that's not how it works. It's to keep us quiet and in place.
I think that's exactly what happens in Iran. I think one last point on this panel, which is really important, is that when I was studying about the death penalty in America, I came across a lot of studies that were done about the ratio between the rate of executions and the rate of crime, how it affected. And there is absolutely no correlation, no matter whether the states that execute don't necessarily have lower crime rate than the states that don't execute.
They have higher crime rates. States in the United States, states with a death penalty have higher rates of violent crime than states who don't have the death penalty. So it's absolutely not a deterrent. And in fact, what actually deters crime, this is up for debate, but it's not the severity of the crime, it's the likelihood that you're going to get a punishment, right? The likelihood that you're going to get caught is more determining of whether or not you're going to commit a crime versus how severe the punishment is. And that applies right here in California because a lot of murders happen in this state every year. Thousands of people get murdered in this state. Yet only 50% of murders are solved every year in this state. So what that means is half of all people who murder get off free. They're not being held accountable. They're not being punished. Nothing is going to happen to them. And so that is more likely negatively affecting our rate of violent crime, not the fact that we have a death penalty. So that's another important thing. I don't know what it's like in Iran. I don't know if unsolved murder is a problem, but it's a big problem here.
Thank you. Are there any more questions for Anna? Yes, last question.
Yeah, I wanted to know if you could explain how much work or activity towards root cause of violence and poverty regarding the socio-economic cause in order to oppose the escaping the death penalty as a cause of violence.
Thank you. Briefly.
Thank you. Yes. Well, so it's an important part of the mitigation. So in the actual case, the death penalty case, where the person came from, if they were impoverished, if they came from a poor family, if they didn't have enough money to eat, all of those facts can be considered by the court when a jury decides whether or not somebody who committed first-degree murder deserves the death penalty or life in prison without the possibility of parole. So that's where it comes into play. When it comes to public opinion, it's terrible. It's a terrible, terrible thing when you're trying to do what I do, which is convince people that the death penalty is a bad idea. And that's because it's for a lot of reasons, and it would take me a long time to explain it, but the thing with shifting public opinion on the death penalty is you have to pull away from individual cases. The second you start talking about an individual case or the person on death row, no matter what a terrible life, what a sad individual, no matter what horrible things happened to that person that led him to commit that crime, if you start talking about all those things, all that injustice, at the end of the day, you're left with the crime. And you've gotten yourself stuck with the facts of a terrible, horrible, unimaginable crime. And from there, you can't convince anybody that the death penalty is bad when you're stuck talking about a horrible murder. So for public opinion, it's better to pull back and talk about innocence, talk about victims, family members that don't want execution. That's all really important in this conversation when you're trying to shift public opinion.
Thank you very much. I'm really sorry that we don't have any more time to take more questions, but all the things that Anna has talked about and all the questions that you've raised are very interesting in how we're trying to organize ourselves in a campaign against the death penalty in Iran. So hopefully with her help, we'll put everything up on our website and we can carry on this debate later. Thank you very much. We're going to take a break for 15 minutes. We come back at 4:30 to start the next panel. Thank you. Thank you very much.